The morning sun beat down hard on the dusty auction yard, making everything shimmer in the heat. Rows of metal fencing created makeshift pens where dozens of horses waited their turn. Some paced nervously, others stood perfectly still, but all of them seemed to know something big was about to happen. In pen number 7, a brown mare stood alone in the corner. Her head hung low, and her once beautiful coat looked dull and lifeless. Deep lines around her eyes told stories of disappointment and failed dreams. This was Belle, though most people here just called her lot number 43. The paperwork clipped to her pen told the whole sad story. 12 years old. Multiple breeding attempts over 4 years. 0 successful pregnancies. The word barren was stamped in red letters across the top of her file. In the horse breeding world, that single word meant everything. It meant she was worthless. People walked past her pen all morning. Ranchers, trainers, and horse dealers moved through the rows like sharks hunting for prey. They studied bloodlines, checked teeth, and felt legs. But when they reached Belle's pen, most didn't even slow down. The red stamp on her papers was like a warning sign that kept everyone away. "Poor old girl," mumbled Tom, the auctioneer's assistant, as he refilled her water bucket. "Been through 3 different ranches in 2 years. Nobody wants a mare who can't produce foals." Belle lifted her head slightly when she heard his voice, but quickly looked away again. She had learned not to hope anymore. Hope only led to more disappointment. At the back of the auction yard, a man in worn jeans and a faded blue shirt leaned against his old pickup truck. Jake Rodriguez had been ranching for over 20 years, but the past few months had been the hardest of his life. His prize stallion, Thunder, had died suddenly from colic, leaving Jake with just 2 young foals and a mountain of debt. Jake's ranch was small compared to the big operations in the area. He couldn't afford fancy horses or expensive breeding programs. Most days, he barely had enough money to keep feed in the barn and hay in the fields. His friends told him he should sell the ranch and find work in town, but Jake couldn't imagine life without horses. "You thinking about bidding on anything today?" asked Ray, Jake's neighbor and longtime friend. Ray owned the spread next to Jake's and often worried about his stubborn friend's financial situation. "Just looking," Jake replied, though his eyes kept drifting back to pen number 7. Something about that brown mare caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she stood apart from the others, or maybe it was the sadness in her eyes that reminded him of his own feelings lately. The auction started at noon with the younger horses. Prices were high, and Jake watched wealthy ranchers bid thousands of dollars on horses he could only dream of owning. His hand stayed firmly in his pocket, knowing he had less than $800 to his name. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd began to thin out. The expensive horses were gone, and now they were getting to the older animals, the problem cases, and the unwanted ones. Jake found himself moving closer to the auction ring, even though he told himself he was just curious. "Next up is lot number 43, the auctioneer announced in his rapid-fire voice. 12-year-old quarter horse mare. Good bloodlines but proven barren. Starting bid is $200. Belle was led into the ring by a young handler who kept a safe distance from her hooves. She moved slowly, her head still low, as if she knew this was just another rejection waiting to happen. The bright lights of the auction ring made her coat look even duller, and Jake could see her ribs showing slightly through her skin. 200, do I hear 200? The auctioneer called out. Silence filled the arena. Jake looked around and saw people shaking their heads or looking at their phones. Nobody wanted a barren mare, especially one who looked so beaten down. 150, how about 150 to get us started? Still nothing. The auctioneer tried again, dropping the price to $100. Jake felt his heart racing as he watched. The mare standing there, completely alone in the bright lights. It reminded him too much of how he felt these days. $50? Surely someone will give me $50 for this mare? Jake's hand moved toward his pocket where he kept his thin roll of bills. Ree grabbed his arm and whispered urgently, "Don't even think about it, Jake. You can't afford another mouth to feed, especially one that can't earn her keep." But Jake wasn't really listening to Ray anymore. He was watching Belle, and for just a moment she lifted her head and looked directly at him. Their eyes met across the crowded arena, and Jake saw something there that made his chest tight. It wasn't just sadness, it was a quiet dignity, a strength that hadn't been completely broken despite everything she had been through. $25. I'll take $25 just to move this along, the auctioneer said, his voice showing his frustration. That's when Jake's hand shot up. He didn't plan it. He didn't think about the money or the practical problems. He just raised his hand like it had a mind of its own. 25 to the gentleman in the blue shirt, the auctioneer called out, sounding relieved to finally have a bid. Jake, what are you doing? Ray hissed, but Jake ignored him. Do I hear 30? The arena was quiet again. Jake held his breath, suddenly hoping nobody else would bid. He wanted this mare, though he couldn't explain why even to himself. Going once, going twice, ... Sold to bidder number 114 for $25. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and just like that bell belonged to Jake. As the handler led her out of the ring, she turned her head and looked at Jake again. This time, he could swear he saw something different in her eyes. Maybe it was hope, or maybe he was just imagining things. Ray shook his head as they walked toward the office to complete the paperwork. $25 might not sound like much, but you still have to feed her, Jake. And what's the point if she can't have foals? Jake signed the papers and handed over his money, leaving him with less than he needed for groceries that week. As he walked toward the holding pens to collect his new horse, he tried to answer Ray's question in his own mind. Maybe there didn't need to be a point. Maybe sometimes you just did what felt right even when it didn't make sense on paper. As Jake approached Belle's pen, she raised her head again and took a small step toward him. Hello, girl, he said softly, reaching his hand through the fence. Looks like you're coming home with me. For the first time all day, Belle moved closer instead of backing away. She didn't let him touch her yet, but she stood near the fence and studied his face with those dark, intelligent eyes. Jake smiled for the first time in weeks. He had no idea that this $25 horse would change his life forever. The paperwork took longer than Jake expected. While he waited in line at the auction office, he kept glancing back toward the holding pens where Belle waited. Part of him couldn't believe what he had just done. $25 might not sound like much to some people, but right now it represented almost his last bit of spending money. You sure about this, buddy? Ray asked for the third time, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. It's not too late to change your mind. That they give you your money back if you asked? Jake shook his head. I'm sure. But even as he said it, he wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. His small ranch was already struggling. Feed costs kept going up, and his income had dropped to almost nothing since Thunder died. Taking on another horse, especially one that couldn't earn her keep by producing foals, seemed like financial suicide. The clerk behind the desk was a tired-looking woman with gray hair pulled back in a messy bun. She stamped Jake's papers with more force than necessary and slid them across the counter. Lot 43 is yours, she said without looking up. You'll need to pick her up within 2 hours or pay boarding fees. As Jake walked back toward the pens, he noticed other people staring at him. Word traveled fast at horse auctions, and apparently his purchase of the worthless mare had already become gossip. A group of well-dressed ranchers near the gate stopped talking when he passed, but he could feel their eyes following him. That's the guy who bought the barren mare, he heard one of them whisper. $25, another voice added with a laugh. Still paid too much if you ask me? Jake's cheeks burned, but he kept walking. He had dealt with whispers and judgment before. When you were a small-time rancher competing with operations worth millions, people always had opinions about your choices. Belle was standing in the same corner of her pen when Jake arrived with a halter and lead rope. She watched him approach but didn't move closer. Up close, Jake could see even more signs of her hard life. There were old scars on her legs, probably from barbed wire, and her hooves needed attention from a farrier. Easy, girl, Jake said softly. As he opened the pen gate, we're going to take a ride to your new home. Belle allowed him to slip the halter over her head, but Jake could feel the tension in her body. She had been through this routine many times before: new people, new promises, new disappointments. Why should this time be any different? The walk to Jake's trailer felt like a mile, even though it was only about 50 yards. Belle moved slowly, her head low, as if every step required great effort. Other horses in nearby pens whinnied and called out, but Belle didn't respond. She seemed lost in her own world of sadness. Jake's trailer was nothing fancy, just a basic two-horse model that had seen better days. The paint was faded and there were rust spots around the wheel wells, but it was solid and safe. He had bought it used 10 years ago when times were better, and it had served him well. Loading Belle took patience. She stopped at the bottom of the rump and sniffed the air inside the trailer. Jake could see her thinking, weighing her options. She had probably been loaded into trailers dozens of times, heading to new ranches full of hope, only to be loaded up again when she failed to meet expectations. "It's okay," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you've been disappointed before, but I'm not asking you to be anything you're not." Something in his tone must have reached her because Belle took a tentative step forward. Then another. Within a few minutes she was standing quietly in the trailer, and Jake was securing the latch behind her. Ray followed Jake to his truck and stood by the driver's window as Jake started the engine. "You know what people are going to say about this, right?" "People are going to say what they want to say regardless," Jake replied, adjusting his rearview mirror to check on Belle. "Besides, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm crazy." The drive home took 45 minutes on winding country roads. Jake drove slower than usual, taking corners gently and avoiding sudden stops. Through his mirror he could see Belle standing quietly in the trailer. She didn't fight or panic like some horses did. She just stood there with that same resigned patience she had shown all day. Halfway home, Jake stopped at a feed store to pick up some hay. While the clerk loaded bales into his truck bed, Jake went back to check on Belle. She turned her head when she heard his footsteps, and for the first time, Jake thought he saw a tiny spark of curiosity in her eyes. "Almost there, girl," he said. "Through the trailer slats. Just a little bit further." The final stretch of road to Jake's ranch was gravel and dirt. His property wasn't much to look at: a small farmhouse that needed paint, a barn with a few missing shingles, and about 40 acres of pasture surrounded by aging fence. It wasn't the kind of place that impressed visitors, but it was home. As Jake pulled into his driveway, he could see his two foals, Luna and Cisco, running toward the fence. They were both yearlings, barely old enough to be weaned, and they had been Jake's only company since Thunder died. Their excited whinnying filled the air as the trailer approached. Jake parked near the barn and turned off the engine. For a moment he just sat there, wondering what he had gotten himself into. Belle was quiet in the trailer behind him, and he could hear Luna and Cisco calling out to the newcomer they couldn't yet see when Jake opened the trailer door. Belle looked out at her new surroundings with cautious eyes. The ranch was smaller than the places she had lived before, but it felt different somehow, quieter, more peaceful. There was something about the way Jake moved around her, no rushing, no impatience, just calm, steady movements. Belle walked down the trailer ramp and stood in the barnyard, taking in everything around her. Luna and Cisco pressed against the pasture fence, their young voices calling out greetings. Belle lifted her head slightly and acknowledged them with a soft nicker, the first sound Jake had heard her make. "Those are your new pasture mates, Jake," explained, leading Belle toward the fence. "Luna is the bay filly and Cisco is the gray colt. They're good kids, just a little excited to meet you." As they approached the fence, Luna reached her nose through the rails, trying to touch the new mare. Belle stepped closer and allowed the young horse to sniff her neck. It was a small gesture, but Jake took it as a good sign. Jake led Belle into the pasture and removed her halter. She stood still for a moment, then walked slowly toward the water trough. Luna and Cisco followed at a respectful distance, their curiosity obvious but their manners intact. As Belle lowered her head to drink, Jake leaned against the fence and watched his three horses. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It had been a long, strange day, and Jake still wasn't sure he had made the right choice. But watching Belle take her first drink of water on his land, surrounded by two young horses who seemed eager to welcome her, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in months. It might have been hope, or maybe it was just the satisfaction of doing something good. Even if it didn't make financial sense, whatever. It felt right. The first morning after Belle arrived, Jake woke up before sunrise like he always did. But instead of going straight to his coffee maker, he found himself walking to the kitchen window that overlooked the pasture. In the gray light of dawn, he could see three shapes scattered across the field. Luna and Cisco were grazing near the fence, but Belle stood alone at the far end of the pasture, as far from everything as she could get. Jake pulled on his boots and jacket and headed outside with a bucket of grain. The morning air was crisp, and his breath made small clouds as he walked toward the fence. Luna and Cisco trotted over immediately, their tails up and their ears forward. They knew the sound of that grain bucket meant breakfast, but Belle didn't move. She lifted her head and watched Jake from her distant corner, but she made no effort to come closer. Jake poured grain into the feeding troughs and waited, hoping she might change her mind. After 10 minutes of standing perfectly still, Belle finally began walking toward the food, but she moved slowly and kept her distance from Jake the entire time. "Take your time, girl," Jake said softly, stepping back from the fence. "Nobody's going to rush you here." That became the pattern for the first week. Belle would eat when Jake brought food, but only after he moved away. She would drink from the water trough, but only when he wasn't watching. She seemed to exist in her own separate world, sharing the same space as the other horses, but not really connecting with anyone. Jake's neighbor, Ray, stopped by on the third day to see how things were going. He found Jake leaning against the pasture fence, watching his horses graze in the morning sun. "How's your expensive mare working out?" Ray asked with a grin. "She's settling in," Jake replied, though they both could see Belle standing apart from the others. "Just needs time." Ray shook his head. "Jake, I've been around horses my whole life, and some of them never come around. The mare has been hurt too many times. She might never trust anyone again." Jake knew Ray meant well, but hearing those words out loud made his chest tight. "Maybe," he said, "but maybe not." By the end of the first week, Jake noticed small changes. Belle had started eating closer to Luna and Cisco, though she still kept several feet between herself and the younger horses. When Jake called out, "Good morning," from the fence, her ears would twitch forward slightly before she turned away. The real breakthrough came during the second week. Jake was repairing a section of fence when a thunderstorm rolled in faster than expected. The sky went from blue to black in minutes, and the first drops of rain were the size of quarters. Jake grabbed his tools and ran for the barn, but as he reached the door, he looked back to check on his horses. Luna and Cisco were already heading for the shelter, but Belle was still standing in the open field. Thunder crashed overhead and lightning lit up the sky, but Belle didn't move. She just stood there in the rain, getting soaked, as if she didn't know she was allowed to seek shelter without thinking. Jake dropped his tools and walked back into the storm. The rain was coming down hard now, and he was drenched within seconds. Belle watched him approach, her ears pinned back and her body tense. "Come on, girl," Jake called out over the thunder. "You don't have to stand out here." He didn't try to catch her or force her to move. He just stood there in the pouring rain about 10 feet away and waited. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and Belle finally took a step toward him, then another. Slowly, carefully, she followed Jake toward the barn. Once they reached the shelter, Belle shook herself and moved to the far corner of the barn. But she was inside, dry and safe, and that felt like a victory to Jake. He grabbed a towel from his tack room and dried himself off, trying not to stare at Belle too obviously. "Smart girl," he said quietly. "See, sometimes good things happen when you trust someone." From that day forward, Belle started watching Jake more closely. When he worked around the ranch, she would position herself where she could see him. If he was fixing fence in the north pasture, she would graze nearby. If he was working in the barn, She would stand near the doorway. Luna and Cisco seemed to sense the change in Belle's behavior. The two young horses had been patient with their new pasture mate, never pushing too hard for attention. But now they began including her in their daily routines. When they moved from one part of the pasture to another, they would wait to see if Belle wanted to follow. When they played their young horse games of chase and tag, they would run past Belle as if inviting her to join. Belle never joined their games, but Jake could see her watching with interest. Sometimes her ears would prick forward when Luna and Cisco were being particularly playful, and once Jake thought he saw the beginning of what might have been a smile around her eyes. The breakthrough with the storm seemed to open something in Belle. She started coming to the fence when Jake called her name, though she still wouldn't let him touch her. When he brought treats, carrots, or apples from his kitchen, she would take them from his hand, but quickly and carefully, making sure their skin never actually made contact. Jake began talking to her while he worked around the ranch. He told her about his day, about the weather, about his plans for fixing up the property. Belle would listen with her ears forward, occasionally nodding her head as if she understood every word. "You know what I think?" Jake said one evening as he filled water troughs. "I think you've been waiting for someone to see you as more than just a breeding machine. Well, guess what? Here, you're just Belle. You don't have to be anything except yourself." That night, Jake looked out his kitchen window before bed and saw something that made him smile. Belle was standing near Luna and Cisco instead of in her usual corner. Not touching them, but close enough that they were clearly together. As a group, it was the first time since her arrival that she had chosen to be social. The next morning brought another small miracle. When Jake walked out with the grain bucket, Belle actually took a few steps toward him before stopping and waiting. It wasn't much, but it was progress. She was beginning to believe that this place might be different from all the others. Jake poured her grain and stepped back as usual, but this time Belle only waited a few seconds before approaching her food. As she ate, Jake noticed that her coat was starting to look shinier. The good food and lack of stress were beginning to show. "You're getting prettier every day," Jake told her, and Belle's ears flicked toward him in acknowledgement. Over the following days, Belle continued to come out of her shell bit by bit. She started following Jake around the pasture when he checked fence lines. She would walk about 20 feet behind him, stopping when he stopped, moving when he moved. If Jake turned around to look at her, she would freeze and pretend she wasn't. Following him at all. One afternoon, while Jake was cleaning out water troughs, Belle surprised him by walking up and standing just a few feet away. She didn't try to interact with him, but she watched everything he did with intense interest. When Jake reached for his scrub brush, Belle jumped back slightly, but she didn't run away. "It's okay," Jake said calmly, showing her the brush. "Just cleaning your water, making sure it's nice and fresh for you." Belle stretched her neck forward and sniffed the brush, then looked at Jake as if to say, "I'm watching you, but I approve of your work." That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Jake sat on his porch and watched his 3 horses grazing in the golden light. Belle was still keeping some distance from Luna and Cisco, but the gap was getting smaller every day. She was learning to trust again, one small step at a time. Jake smiled and raised his coffee mug in a toast to the pasture. "Here's to second chances," he said out loud, and Belle lifted her head as if she had heard him and agreed. 3 months had passed since Belle arrived at Jake's ranch, and the changes were impossible to ignore. What started as small shifts in behavior had grown into something much bigger. Jake noticed it first during his morning routine. Belle no longer waited for him to move away before eating. Instead, she would approach her grain while he was still standing nearby. Though she kept a respectful distance, her physical transformation was even more dramatic. The dull, lifeless coat that had made her look so defeated at the auction was now rich and glossy. Her ribs no longer showed through her skin, and there was a healthy roundness to her belly that spoke of good food and peaceful days. But it was more than just better nutrition. There was something different in the way she carried herself, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Jake was mucking out stalls one morning when he heard Luna let out a sharp whinny of alarm. He dropped his pitchfork and rushed outside to see what was wrong. A neighbor's dog had somehow gotten through the fence and was chasing Luna and Cisco around the pasture, barking and snapping at their heels, but before Jake could grab a halter or call out to the dog, Belle stepped into action. She positioned herself between the dog and the two young horses, her ears pinned back and her head low. The mare, who had been so timid and withdrawn just months ago, was now standing her ground like a protective mother, ready to fight if necessary. "Hey!" Jake shouted at the dog while climbing through the fence. But Belle had already taken charge. She lunged forward with teeth bared, and the startled dog yelped and ran back toward the hole in the fence. Belle followed for a few steps, making sure the threat was really gone, before turning back to check on Luna and Cisco. Jake stood frozen, watching as Belle gently nuzzled both young horses, as if making sure they were unharmed. Luna and Cisco pressed close to her sides, clearly grateful for her protection. It was like watching a family reunion, three horses who have found their place with each other. "Well, I'll be," Jake murmured to himself. This was not the same broken mare he had brought home from the auction. This Belle was confident, protective, and clearly bonded with her pasture mates. The changes in Belle's behavior continued over the following weeks. She started greeting Jake when he arrived each morning, walking up to the fence and nickering softly. She still wouldn't let him touch her, but she would stand close enough that he could see the trust growing in her dark eyes. One evening, Jake was sitting on his porch after a long day of ranch work when his phone rang. It was Dr. Wilson, the local veterinarian who had been Jake's friend for over 15 years. "Jake, I've been meaning to stop by and check on that mare you bought at the auction," Dr. Wilson said. "I heard you picked up one of the older horses. How's she working out?" Better than I expected," Jake replied, watching Belle graze peacefully with Luna and Cisco. "She's put on weight and seems to be settling in well." "That's good to hear. Mind if I swing by tomorrow?" "I'm heading out your way anyway to check on Ray's stallion. Might as well take a look at your new girl while I'm at it." Jake agreed, though he felt a little nervous about having Belle examined. She had come so far in building trust, and he didn't want a stressful vet visit to set back her progress. Dr. Wilson arrived the next afternoon in his familiar white truck with Wilson Veterinary Services painted on the side. Jake had known the vet since his early days of ranching, and Dr. Wilson had helped him through many difficult situations over the years. He was a patient man with gentle hands and a calm demeanor that most horses seem to appreciate. "So where's this mystery mare?" Dr. Wilson asked as he pulled his equipment bag from the truck. Jake pointed toward the pasture where Belle was grazing with Luna and Cisco. "That's her, the brown one? Her name's Belle?" Dr. Wilson studied her for a moment, his experienced eyes taking in her appearance and posture. "She looks good from here. Nice weight on her, good muscle tone. You've been taking care of her well." "She's been taking care of herself mostly," Jake replied, "and keeping an eye on those two youngsters like she's their mother." As they approached the pasture, Belle lifted her head and watched them warily. She didn't run away, but she positioned herself so she could bolt if needed. Dr. Wilson noticed her cautious behavior immediately. "Been through some rough times, hasn't she?" the vet observed quietly. "The paperwork said she was barren," Jake explained. "Spent years being moved from ranch to ranch, trying different breeding programs. None of them worked." Dr. Wilson nodded knowingly. "I've seen it before. Some mares just don't respond well to pressure. The stress of constantly being evaluated and tested can shut down their natural cycles." Getting Belle into the barn for examination took patience and gentle coaxing. Jake led Luna and Cisco in first, and Belle followed reluctantly, not wanting to be separated from her adopted family. Once inside, she stood quietly but alert, her eyes tracking every movement Dr. Wilson made. "Easy, girl," the vet said softly as he approached with his stethoscope. "Just going to listen to your heart and lungs." Belle tensed when Dr. Wilson first touched her, but she didn't pull away. Jake stood at her head, talking to her in the same calm voice he used every morning during feeding time. Gradually, Belle relaxed enough for the vet to complete his basic examination. "Heart sounds good, lungs are clear," Dr. Wilson reported as he worked. "Her coat is excellent, eyes are bright." And her weight is perfect. You've done a great job with her, Jake. As the examination continued, Dr. Wilson checked Belle's legs, hooves, and teeth. Everything seemed normal until he began examining her sides and belly area. His hands moved slowly and methodically, and Jake noticed the vet's expression change. From routine concentration to something more intense? Jake, Dr. Wilson said quietly, his hands still on Belle's flank. When did you say you got this mare? About 3 months ago. Why? Is something wrong? Dr. Wilson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he continued his examination, his experienced hands feeling along Belle's sides and lower belly. Belle stood perfectly still, as if she sensed the importance of the moment. Jake, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully. Before you answer, has this mare been with any stallion since you brought her home? No, Jake replied immediately. I only have Luna and Cisco, and they're both too young. There's no way she could have been bred here. Dr. Wilson stepped back and looked at Jake with a strange expression on his face. Well, that's interesting, because unless I'm very much mistaken, this mare is pregnant. Jake felt like someone had knocked the wind out of him. That's impossible. The paperwork clearly stated she was barren. She's been tested multiple times. I know what the paperwork said, Dr. Wilson replied, moving his hands along Belle's sides again. But I've been examining pregnant mares for over 20 years, and I'm telling you, this mare is carrying a foal. Jake stared at Belle, who seemed completely unbothered by the conversation happening around her. How can you be sure? Feel right. Here, Dr. Wilson said, guiding Jake's hand to Belle's lower belly. That firmness, the way she's carrying her weight, and look at her utter development. All classic signs. Jake's hand trembled slightly as he felt what the vet was describing. There was definitely something different about Belle's shape, something he had attributed to good feeding and lack of stress. But now, looking at her with new eyes, he could see what Dr. Wilson meant. If she is pregnant, Jake said slowly, how far along would she be? Dr. Wilson calculated quickly in his head. Based on what I'm seeing and feeling, I guess she's about 5 months along, which means she was already pregnant when you bought her. The implications of this hit Jake like a thunderbolt. Belle had been carrying a foal all along during those terrible months of being labeled barren and unwanted. She had endured the stress of multiple ranch changes, the disappointment of failed breeding attempts, and the humiliation of the auction, all while protecting the life growing inside her. Why didn't anyone catch this before? Jake asked. Could be several reasons, Dr. Wilson explained. Some mares don't show much until later in pregnancy, and if she was stressed or undernourished, that could have masked the signs. Plus, once a mare gets labeled as barren, people stop looking for pregnancy symptoms. Jake looked at Belle with new wonder and respect. She had kept her secret safe through everything, probably not even understanding why she felt different. And now, in the safety and peace of his small ranch, with Luna and Cisco as her adopted family, she was finally able to let her body show what had been true all along. What do we do now? Jake asked. Dr. Wilson smiled. Now we take extra good care of our expectant mother. We'll need to increase her nutrition, make sure she gets proper prenatal care, and prepare for a foal to arrive in about 4 months. As they led Belle back to the pasture, Jake's mind was racing with questions and possibilities. Luna and Cisco trotted over immediately, as if they somehow sensed that something important had happened. Belle nuzzled both young horses gently before moving toward her favorite grazing spot. Jake, Dr. Wilson said as he packed up his equipment, this mare has been through a lot, but she's found her place here. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. After the vet left, Jake sat on his porch and watched his 3 horses, soon to be 4, grazing in the golden evening light. Belle, the mare everyone had given up on. Jake barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Dr. Wilson's amazed expression and heard those impossible words, "This mare is pregnant." He kept getting up to look out his bedroom window toward the pasture, where Belle grazed, peacefully under the starlight, completely unaware that her secret was finally out. The next morning, Jake called Dr. Wilson before he even had his coffee. Doc, I need to ask you again, are you absolutely certain about Belle? Dr. Wilson chuckled on the other end of the phone. Jake, I've been doing this for 25 years. I'd stake my reputation on it, that Mare is definitely carrying a foal. But how is it possible? The paperwork from her previous owners. Paperwork can be wrong, Dr. Wilson interrupted gently, especially when people see what they expect to see. Once a mare gets labeled as barren, everyone stops looking for signs of pregnancy. They assume every weight gain is just better feeding, every behavior change is just settling in. Jake rubbed his forehead, still trying to process everything. What do I need to do? I've never dealt with a pregnant mare before. First thing is to increase her nutrition. She's feeding herself and a growing foal now. I'll drop off some mare and foal feed this afternoon. And Jake? Dr. Wilson paused. You might want to prepare for some visitors. Word travels fast in horse country. Dr. Wilson wasn't kidding about word traveling fast. By noon, Jake's phone had rung 6 times. First it was Ray, his neighbor, who had heard the news from his wife who worked at the feed store. Then it was the farrier, the hay supplier, and even Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store in town. Is it true what they're saying about that mare you bought? Each caller asked. The one they said was barren? Jake found himself telling the story over and over, each time feeling more amazed by the impossible turn of events. Belle, the $25 mare that nobody wanted, was going to have a baby. The first visitor arrived just after lunch. Jake was in the barn organizing his tack room when he heard a truck pull into his driveway. Through the window, he saw Tom Miller, one of the largest horse breeders in the county, stepping out of an expensive pickup truck. Jake had never spoken to Tom personally, though he knew the man by reputation. Tom owned hundreds of horses and ran an operation worth millions. He was not the kind of person who usually visited small ranches like Jake's. You Jake Rodriguez? Tom asked as he approached the barn. That's me, Jake replied, wiping his hands on his jeans. What can I do for you? I heard some interesting news about a mare you bought at auction. The brown quarter horse mare that was supposedly barren. Jake felt his defenses go up immediately. What about her? Tom smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. Well, if what I'm hearing is true, that mare might be worth considerably more than the $25 you paid for her. She's not for sale, Jake said quickly. Everything's for sale for the right price, Tom replied, looking past Jake toward the pasture where Belle was grazing. Mind if I take a look at her? Jake didn't want to be rude, but he also didn't like the way this conversation was heading. You can look from here. Tom studied Belle for several minutes, his experienced eyes taking in her condition. She's definitely in foal, he said finally. Question is, who's the father? If it's the right stallion, that foal could be worth serious. Money, I wouldn't know, Jake said honestly. I bought her as is. Well, I'd like to make you an offer, Tom said, pulling out his phone and showing Jake a number. This is what I'm willing to pay for her right now today. Jake looked at the screen and felt his knees go weak. The number was more money than he made in 2 years of ranching. It would pay off his debts, fix his buildings, and give him a fresh start. But when he looked toward Belle, peacefully grazing with Luna and Cisco, Jake shook his head. Like I said, she's not for sale. Tom's friendly demeanor disappeared. You're making a mistake, Rodriguez. That mare could have complications. She's older, she's been stressed, and you don't have the facilities to handle a difficult birth. Take my money now, before something goes wrong. I appreciate the offer, Jake said firmly, but my answer is no. After Tom left, Jake sat on his porch steps and watched his horses. Belle had moved closer to the fence, as if she sensed that strangers had been discussing her. Luna and Cisco flanked her protectively, and Jake smiled at how the three had become a real family. His phone rang. Again. This time it was a woman named Carol who claimed to represent Belle's previous owners. We're prepared to offer you compensation for the mare's return, Carol said in a businesslike tone. There was obviously an error in the paperwork regarding her breeding status. No error, Jake replied. I bought her fair and square at a public auction. She was sold as barren, and that's what I paid for. But surely you understand that changes things. The only thing that's changed is that she's happy now, Jake interrupted. She's staying right where she is. The calls continued throughout the afternoon. Horse traders, breeders, and even a lawyer who claimed Belle's pregnancy invalidated the auction sale. Jake turned them all down, but each conversation left him more frustrated and worried. That evening, Dr. Wilson stopped by to deliver the special feed and check on how Jake was handling all the attention. "Regret buying her yet?" the vet asked. With a grin. "Not for a second," Jake replied. "But I had no idea how complicated this would get." "It's going to get more complicated before it gets simpler," Dr. Wilson warned. "When that foal is born, if it's got good bloodlines, people are going to come out of the woodwork." Jake looked toward Belle, who was standing near the barn door as if waiting for her evening grain. "What do you think I should do?" "Exactly what you've been doing," Dr. Wilson said. "Take care of her, keep her safe, and let nature take its course. That Mare has been through enough stress in her life. She doesn't need any more." As if she had heard her name, Belle walked over to the fence and looked directly at Jake. Her eyes were calm and trusting. So different from the fearful, broken mare he had brought home from the auction. "Don't worry, girl," Jake said softly. "Nobody's taking you anywhere." The next few days brought more visitors and phone calls. Some offered money, others threatened legal action, and a few just wanted to see the miracle mare for themselves. Jake turned them all away politely but firmly. Ray stopped by on Thursday evening, finding Jake sitting on his porch with a beer and a worried expression. "Heard you've become quite popular," Ray said, settling into the other porch chair. "Popular isn't the word I'd use," Jake replied. "More like under siege." "Any regrets about not taking that money Tom Miller offered?" Jake was quiet for a moment, watching Belle graze in the fading light. "Ray, I've been broke most of my adult life. That money would solve every financial problem I have." But look at her," Jake said, nodding toward Belle. "For the first time in years, she's happy. She feels safe. She's got Luna and Cisco to look after, and she's finally going to be a mother. How could I take that away from her for money?" Ray smiled and raised his beer bottle. "That's why you're a better man than most, Jake Rodriguez." As the stars came out that night, Jake walked down to the pasture one more time. Belle approached the fence when she saw him coming, something she never would have done months ago. She stood quietly while Jake talked to her, her ears forward and her eyes calm. "I don't know what all this fuss is about," Jake told her. "But I made you a promise the day I brought you home. This is your place now, and nothing's going to change that." Belle nickered softly, as if she understood every word. Then she turned and walked back toward Luna and Cisco, her family complete and her future secure. As Belle's pregnancy progressed into her 7th month, Jake threw himself into preparations like his life depended on it. Every morning after feeding, he would spend hours researching foaling on the internet, reading everything he could find about pregnant mares and newborn foals. His browser history was filled with searches like signs of labor in horses and what to do if foal doesn't breathe. The old barn stall at the far end of his building became Jake's main project. It had been used for storage for years, filled with rusty tools, old hay bales, and equipment he hadn't touched in decades. Jake spent 3 solid days clearing it out, hauling load after load of junk to the dump. "You sure you want to use that stall?" Ray asked one afternoon, finding Jake scrubbing the walls with bleach water. "It's pretty far from the house if something goes wrong at night." "It's the biggest stall I have," Jake replied, not stopping his scrubbing. "And it's the quietest, away from all the noise and activity." Ray watched his friend work with the intensity of a man possessed. "Jake, you know horses have been having babies without human help for thousands of years, right?" "This isn't just any horse," Jake said, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead. "This is Belle. After everything she's been through, I want her to have the perfect place for her foal." Jake installed new lighting in the stall, bright enough to see clearly but gentle enough not to stress Belle. He repaired loose boards, checked every nail and screw, and made sure there were no sharp edges. or protruding objects that could hurt a newborn foal. The floor got fresh, deep bedding, clean straw that Jake fluffed and rearranged daily. Dr. Wilson stopped by twice a week now to check on Belle's progress. Each visit brought good news. Belle's weight was perfect, her vital signs were strong, and the foal was developing normally. But more importantly, Belle herself seemed to glow with contentment. "I've never seen a mare this relaxed during pregnancy," Dr. Wilson observed during one visit. "Usually they get more anxious as they get closer to foaling, but Belle seems completely at peace." Jake wasn't surprised. Belle had blossomed during her pregnancy in ways that went far beyond the physical. She had become the undisputed leader of their little herd, watching over Luna and Cisco with maternal instincts that made Jake's heart swell. When Luna got tangled in some old wire near the fence, Belle was there immediately, nickering urgently until Jake came running. When Cisco wandered too close to the road, Belle would herd him back toward the center of the pasture with gentle but firm nudges. "She's practicing," Jake told Dr. Wilson as they watched Belle guide the two younger horses toward their evening grain. "Getting ready to be a mom." The community's interest in Belle's pregnancy had settled into a routine of regular visitors. Mrs. Patterson from the local feed store brought special molasses treats for pregnant mares. Bobby, the teenage son of a nearby rancher, rode his bike over every few days just to talk to Belle over the fence. Even the mailman started making detours through the property to check on the famous expecting mother, but not all the attention was welcome. Tom Miller continued to call regularly, each time increasing his offer for Belle. The amounts he quoted made Jake's head spin, but his answer never changed. Other breeders sent representatives, and twice Jake found strange cars parked on the road near his property with people taking pictures through telephoto lenses. "It's like she's a celebrity," Jake complained to Ray one evening. "Can't people just leave her alone?" "Famous pregnant horse in small town," Ray replied with a shrug. "Course people are curious, besides most of them mean well." Jake knew Ray was right, but the constant attention made him protective in ways he had never experienced before. He found himself checking on Belle multiple times during the night, shining a flashlight toward the pasture to make sure she was safe and undisturbed. As Belle entered her 8th month, her personality continued to evolve in remarkable ways. The shy, withdrawn mare who had arrived 9 months ago was now confident and social. She would approach strangers at the fence, though she still preferred Jake's company above all others. When children visited, she would lower her head so they could pet her nose, as gentle as a lamb despite her size. Jake started spending more time just sitting in the pasture with his horses. Belle would graze nearby, occasionally walking over to nudge his shoulder with her nose. Luna and Cisco treated him like part of their herd, sometimes using him as a scratching post or simply lying down near him for afternoon naps. "You know what I think?" Jake said to Belle one quiet evening as she stood beside him. "I think you were waiting for the right place to have this baby. Somewhere you felt safe enough to let it happen." Belle's ears flicked toward him at the sound of his voice, and she turned to look at him with those deep, intelligent eyes. Jake could swear she understood every word he said. The preparations intensified as Belle's due date approached. Jake installed a baby monitor in the foaling stall, so he could hear any sounds from his bedroom. He assembled a foaling kit based on Dr. Wilson's recommendations: clean towels, iodine for the umbilical cord, a bottle and Mare's milk replacer just in case, and emergency contact numbers taped to the stall wall. Dr. Wilson gave Jake a crash course in foaling assistance during one of his visits. "Most mares do fine on their own," he explained, "but you need to know what's normal and what's not. If the foal doesn't start breathing immediately, you clear its nose and mouth. If Belle doesn't break the umbilical cord herself, you tie it off and cut it here." Jake practiced the procedures on a stuffed animal until he could do them with his eyes closed. He felt like a nervous father-to-be, checking and rechecking his supplies, reading the same articles over and over. Belle seemed amused by all the fuss. She would watch Jake work on her stall with patient interest, occasionally sniffing his tools or nudging his hand when she wanted attention. She had grown quite large now, her sides rounded and her movements more careful. but she maintained the same calm, contented demeanor that had marked her entire pregnancy. 3 weeks before her due date, Belle started showing signs that birth was approaching. She became more restless, walking the fence line in the evenings and pawing at the ground. Dr. Wilson confirmed that things were progressing normally, and that the foal would probably arrive within the next few weeks. Jake barely left the ranch during those final weeks. He arranged for Ray to handle his few remaining consulting jobs and focused entirely on Belle. Every morning he would find fresh signs that she was getting close, a slight change in her udder, a new restlessness in her movements, a tendency to separate herself from Luna and Cisco. For short periods, the local newspaper even sent a reporter to do a story about the miracle mare and her approaching delivery. Jake reluctantly agreed to the interview, hoping it might discourage some of the more persistent visitors. "This mare has become a symbol of hope for our whole community," the reporter wrote. "Proof that sometimes the things we think are broken can surprise us with new life." Jake read the article twice and decided it captured the truth about Belle perfectly. She had surprised everyone, including herself. Now, as her pregnancy neared its end, Jake could hardly contain his excitement about meeting the foal that had been Belle's secret for so long, standing in the pasture on a warm spring evening, watching Belle graze peacefully with Luna and Cisco. Nearby, Jake felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Whatever happened next, he had given Belle exactly what she needed, a safe place to be herself and become the mother she was always meant to be. Jake woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of restless movement coming through the baby monitor. He had been sleeping lightly for weeks now, his ears tuned to every sound from the barn. This was different from Belle's usual nighttime stirring. There was an urgency to it that made his heart race. He pulled on his jeans and boots without bothering to turn on the lights, and grabbed the flashlight from his bedside table. The April night was cool and crisp, with a full moon casting silver shadows across the pasture. As Jake hurried toward the barn, he could see Belle's silhouette moving restlessly in the foaling stall. "Easy, girl," Jake whispered as he approached. Belle turned toward him, and even in the dim light, he could see the tension in her body. Her sides were heaving slightly, and she kept looking back at her flanks with an expression Jake had never seen before. Jake quickly turned on the stall lights and felt his breath catch. Belle's water had broken, and she was clearly in the early stages of labor. All those weeks of preparation suddenly felt like they hadn't been enough. This was really happening. With shaking hands, Jake called Dr. Wilson's emergency number. The phone rang 4 times before the sleepy voice of the veterinarian answered. "Doc, it's Jake. Belle's in labor." Dr. Wilson was immediately alert. "How long has she been showing signs?" "I just found her like this, but she's definitely started. Her water broke." "I'm on my way," Dr. Wilson said. "Should be there in 20 minutes. How's she acting?" Jake watched Belle pace slowly around the stall, occasionally stopping to paw at the deep straw bedding. Restless but not panicked. "She keeps looking at me like she wants me to fix something." "That's normal. Just stay calm and keep talking to her. Let her know you're there." After hanging up, Jake entered the stall slowly. Belle walked over to him immediately and pressed her nose against his chest, seeking comfort. Jake could feel her whole body trembling with the effort of labor. "It's okay, Belle," he said softly, stroking her neck. "You're going to be a great mom. I know you've been waiting a long time for this." Belle seemed to find comfort in his voice. She stayed close to Jake for several minutes before another contraction hit her. Jake watched in amazement as her body worked to bring new life into the world. All those people who had called her barren, who had given up on her, they had been so wrong. Luna and Cisco had gathered at the stall door, their young faces curious and concerned. They could sense that something important was happening, and they whinnied softly to Belle, as if offering their support. Belle acknowledged them with a gentle nicker before turning her attention back to the serious work of labor. Dr. Wilson arrived in record time, his truck sliding to a stop in the gravel driveway. He hurried into the barn with his medical bag, took one look at Belle, and nodded approvingly. "She's doing great," he told Jake. "First-time mothers, especially older ones, can sometimes have difficulties, But Belle looks like she knows exactly what she's doing. As if she had heard the compliment, Belle walked over to Dr. Wilson and allowed him to examine her. The vet's experienced hands checked her progress while Belle stood patiently, trusting the two men who had become her protectors. She's progressing. Normally, Dr. Wilson reported, we should see the foal's front hooves soon. Jake felt his stomach flip with nervous excitement. After months of waiting and wondering, Belle's foal was finally coming into the world. Labor progressed steadily over the next hour. Belle would walk, lie down, get up again, and paw at the straw. Jake stayed by her side through it all, offering quiet words of encouragement. Dr. Wilson monitored her carefully but didn't interfere, letting Belle's body do what it was designed to do. There, Dr. Wilson said suddenly, pointing toward Belle's hindquarters. I can see the hooves. Jake leaned forward and saw two small, dark hooves emerging. His heart pounded so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. This was the moment he had been dreaming about for months. Belle lay down in the straw and began pushing in earnest. With each contraction, more of the foal became visible. First the hooves, then thin legs, then a small dark nose. Jake found himself holding his breath, afraid to blink in case he missed something. Come on, Belle, Jake whispered. You can do this. With one final, powerful push, the foal slipped out onto the straw. Belle immediately turned to look at her baby, her eyes wide with wonder and instinct. The foal was still and silent, covered in the membrane that had protected it during pregnancy. Why isn't it moving? Jake asked, panic rising in his voice. Give her a minute, Dr. Wilson said calmly. Belle knows what to do. As if responding to the vet's confidence, Belle began licking her foal vigorously, cleaning away the membrane and stimulating its circulation. Within seconds that felt like hours, the foal took its first breath and let out a weak but healthy whinny. Jake felt tears running down his cheeks. The sound of that first cry was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. Belle continued cleaning. Her baby, nickering softly in a voice Jake had never heard before, the voice of a mother talking to her child. It's a colt, Dr. Wilson announced with a grin. A beautiful, healthy colt. The foal was dark bay with 4 white socks and a white blaze down his face. Even wet and newborn, Jake could see he was going to be a handsome horse. But more importantly, he was alive and strong, already trying to lift his head and figure out this new world he had entered. Belle's maternal instincts were perfect. She positioned herself so the foal could nurse as soon as he was ready, and she never stopped talking to him in gentle nickers and soft wuffles. Luna and Cisco watched from the stall door, their eyes wide with fascination at the newest member of their family. What are you going to call him? Dr. Wilson asked as he cleaned up his equipment. Jake watched the colt struggle to get his long legs under him for his first attempt at standing. The name came to him immediately, as if he had known it all along. Milagro, Jake said. It means miracle in Spanish, Dr. Wilson smiled. Perfect name for a perfect situation. Within an hour of birth, Milagro was on his feet and nursing strongly. Belle stood proudly over him, occasionally nuzzling his back or gently guiding him with her nose. She looked like she had been born to be a mother, confident and protective and completely in love with her baby Dot. As the sun began to rise over the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Jake sat in the straw watching Belle and Milagro. Bond, the mare who had been labeled worthless, had just given birth to a perfect, healthy foal. The mare who had been called barren had proved that sometimes miracles really do happen. Luna and Cisco were finally allowed into the stall to meet their new family member. They approached carefully, sniffing Milagro with gentle curiosity while Belle watched proudly. Within minutes, the 4 horses had formed a circle of contentment. With Milagro at the center of his adoptive family's attention, Jake pulled out his phone and took a picture, knowing that this moment would live in his memory forever. Belle, standing tall and proud with her perfect foal, surrounded by the young horses who had helped prepare her for motherhood. It was a scene of pure joy, proof that love and patience could overcome any obstacle. Thank you, Jake whispered to Belle. Thank you for trusting me with your miracle. Belle looked at him over Milagro's back and nickered softly, as if to say the thanks were all hers. 6 months after Milagro's birth, Jake stood at his kitchen window with his morning coffee, watching a scene that still took his breath away. Belle grazed peacefully in the center of the pasture while Milagro galloped in circles around her, his dark coat gleaming in the early sunlight. Luna and Cisco had positioned themselves on either side of Belle like protective ants, occasionally nipping at Milagro when his playful energy got too wild. The transformation in Belle was complete and remarkable. The broken, defeated mare from the auction had become a confident, glowing mother who commanded respect from every horse on the property. She watched Milagro's every move with patient eyes, ready to correct him with a gentle nip when he got too rough with his adoptive siblings, or to call him back when he wandered too far from the safety of the herd. Jake's phone rang, interrupting his peaceful morning observation. It was the 5th call this week from someone wanting to buy Milagro or breed to Belle. Word had spread throughout the horse community about the miracle foal, and Jake found himself fielding offers that made his head spin. "Good morning, Mr. Rodriguez," said a polished voice on the other end. "This is Patricia Williams from Champion Bloodlines Ranch. I'm calling about your Mare's colt." Jake sighed. "Let me save you some time, ma'am. Milagro isn't for sale, and Belle isn't available for breeding." "But surely you understand the value of what you have," Patricia pressed. "That colt has exceptional conformation, and his story makes him incredibly marketable. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 for him right now." $50,000. Jake sat down hard in his kitchen chair. That was more money than he had ever seen in his life. It would pay off every debt, fix every building, and set him up comfortably for years to come. "I appreciate the offer," Jake said slowly, "but like I told you, he's not for sale. Mr. Rodriguez, be reasonable. You're a small operation. You can't provide the kind of training and opportunities that a horse like this deserves." Jake looked out at Milagro, who was now nursing contentedly while Belle stood watch over him. "He's got everything he deserves right here." After hanging up, Jake walked outside to check the morning routine. Belle nickered a greeting when she saw him approaching, and Milagro lifted his head from nursing to study the man who brought the daily grain. The foal had grown tremendously in 6 months, his legs long and strong, his coat the same rich bay as his mother's but with distinctive white markings that made him unmistakable. Dr. Wilson arrived for his monthly checkup just as Jake was finishing the feeding. The veterinarian had become more than just a medical professional. He was a friend who had shared in the miracle of Milagro's birth and Belle's transformation. "How's our celebrity family doing?" Dr. Wilson asked, setting down his medical bag. "Near the fence. Healthy and happy," Jake replied. "Though I wish people would stop calling them celebrities." Dr. Wilson laughed as he watched Milagro bound over to investigate the newcomer. The young horse showed no fear of strangers approaching, with the confidence of a foal who had known nothing but kindness since birth. "You know," Dr. Wilson said as he examined Milagro, "I've been a vet for 30 years, and I've never seen a foal develop with such perfect confidence. Most young horses go through fearful phases, but this little guy acts like the whole world belongs to him." Jake smiled, watching Belle supervise the examination with protective but relaxed attention. "That's because he's never had a reason to be afraid." Belle made sure of that. The examination confirmed what Jake could see with his own eyes. Milagro was developing into an exceptional horse. His movement was fluid and athletic, his temperament was perfect, and his intelligence was obvious in the way he studied everything around him. "Jake," Dr. Wilson said as he packed up his equipment, "I have to ask. Don't you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't bought Belle that day?" Jake considered the question while watching his 4 horses interact. Milagro had wandered over to Luna and Cisco, who were teaching him the fine art of mutual grooming. Belle watched from nearby, ready to intervene if the play got too rough. "I try not to think about it," Jake said finally. "But sometimes I wonder if Belle would have ever had the chance to be a mother if she had gone somewhere else." "I don't think so," Dr. Wilson said honestly. "The stress of trying to prove herself again probably would have caused her to lose the foal she needed exactly what you gave her: time, patience, and the freedom to just be a horse." As summer turned to fall, the attention around Belle and Milagro began to change. Instead of people trying to buy them, visitors started coming just to see them. Families would drive from neighboring towns to stand at the fence and watch the miracle mare with her perfect foal. Children would bring apples and carrots, giggling with delight when Belle gently took treats from their small hands. The local newspaper did a follow-up story titled, "6 months later, the miracle continues." The reporter found Jake in his usual spot, leaning against the pasture fence and watching his horses. "Do you ever regret not selling when you had the chance?" the reporter asked. Jake looked at Belle, who was demonstrating proper grazing technique, to Milagro while Luna and Cisco watched like attentive students. "Every horse person I know thinks I'm crazy for turning down that kind of money," Jake said. "But you can't put a price on happiness. Whose happiness, yours or theirs?" "Both," Jake replied with a smile. Belle spent years being told she was worthless. Now she gets to wake up every morning knowing she's the most important horse in someone's world. Milagro gets to grow up knowing he's loved and wanted, and I get to watch it all happen. The story resonated with people far beyond the local horse community. Jake started receiving letters from around the country, from people who had rescued animals, from others who had been written off themselves, from families who found hope in Belle's story of second chances. One letter particularly touched Jake's heart. It was from a young girl whose family had adopted her after years in foster care. "Belle's story is like mine," she wrote in careful handwriting. "Sometimes people think you're broken, but you just need the right family to help you bloom." Jake framed that letter and hung it in his kitchen where he could see it every morning. As winter approached, Jake found himself reflecting on the incredible year that had passed since Belle's arrival. His small ranch had become a destination, his story had touched thousands of people, and his financial situation had actually improved, not from selling his horses, but from the increased business their fame had brought him. People started boarding horses with him specifically because of Belle's story. They wanted their animals to experience the same patient, loving care that had transformed the worthless auction mare into a confident mother. Jake found himself fully booked with horses, whose owners trusted him to provide exactly what Belle had found: a place to heal and grow. Standing in his pasture on a crisp December evening, Jake watched his 4 horses huddled together against the cold. Belle stood protectively over Milagro, who had grown tall and strong but still sought comfort from his mother. Luna and Cisco flanked them like loyal guards, completing the family that had formed so naturally around Belle's gentle leadership. "You know what, Belle?" Jake said softly as the mare lifted her head to acknowledge his voice. "They were all wrong about you. You weren't barren, you were just waiting for the right place to bloom. And you weren't worthless, you were priceless all along." Belle walked over to the fence and stood quietly while Jake stroked her neck. Milagro followed, curious as always about the bond between his mother and the man who had saved them both. As the stars came out overhead, Jake realized that the $25 he had spent at that auction had bought him something far more valuable than a horse. It had bought him a story of hope, a lesson in patience, and a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful gifts come in the most unexpected packages. The mare who had been sold as barren had indeed found her purpose, just not in the way anyone had expected. She had become a mother, a teacher, a symbol of resilience, and most importantly, a beloved member of a family that saw her true worth from the very beginning.